Okay, so today we're going to talk about something that I've been wanting to talk about for a while, which is something that a lot of people will probably object to, and that's fine. But I just want to share my 2 cents of why I'm not a huge fan of things like the fractal, the Helix, the headrush, any of those type of all-in-one digital modeling amps. And I know this is all just the opinions of an old man that nobody truly cares about, but I'm going to share them anyway for your consideration if you're thinking about getting them. Just something else to think about, a different point of view. So I haven't been a fan of digital modelers for a long time, and I haven't really been able to put into words why that is, until today, that is. So let me get into it a little bit. I'll start with a little bit of a backstory. I haven't always been a tube amp guy. I started off on solid states in the 90s when I first started playing because I didn't know any better, and that's what was affordable, so that's what I got. But as I grew in my playing, obviously I got into tube amps as quick as I could, eventually getting into a Mesa Road King, which was a huge milestone for me to be able to afford a Mesa, to be able to sound amazing. So back when I was doing my metal and punk stuff, that was kind of the amp that I always wanted, was the Mesa, and so I finally got it, and it's awesome. It's got 4 channels, every level of gain. You can select any type of power tube. You can do different cabinet selections on there. You could have each channel going to a different cabinet, kind of a thing. Anything from 50 watts all the way to 120 watts of all Mesa power tube goodness. You can set up different channels that sound like Marshalls, Fenders, whatever you want. The thing's just flipping amazing. And ever since I've got into that, I've never looked back as far as at solid state amps. Haven't had a whole lot of interest. Of course, you know, Line 6 came out with like the POD back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it didn't sound anything close to a tube amp anyway, so wasn't interested at that point. However, they've come a long way in recent years, especially with the Helix and you know, the Fractal AX8 and some of the other things that are out there, the Kemper, headrush, some of these other things, even the mooer is sounding a lot better than any of the old ones used to sound. So I can see why people are drawn to them. And I think that the main draw that people have to those things is, number one, it's an all-in-one inclusive package. And so as opposed to a tube amp where you might have to buy a Marshall, and then you might have to buy a Mesa, and you might have to buy a Fender, and then you might have to buy a Vox, that all adds up to a lot of money, whereas you could put all that money into just the Helix and be done with a fraction of the cost. And then they also model some other pedals and stuff as well. But the big thing too is just the convenience factor that you have there, that you could set up, you know, stereo rigs with different amps. You can do basically anything you could dream of, and it's all in one convenient thing that you could bring with you anywhere. And so it's a lot easier than dragging along an actual tube amp. So I totally get why people are into them, and I'm not here to knock them. I'm just here to offer really what I think they're missing by not having an actual tube amp with them. So some of the areas that these digital modelers fall short in is, I think, their stomp box modeling. For example, their clones, their Timmies, their tube screamers, fuzz faces. None of these things sound like the actual pedals, nor do they interact with the amps in the same way that those pedals interact with an amp. All they do is just add a certain style of gain, and it's usually way gainier and just very fake sounding compared to what those things actually sound like in person with the actual amp and pedal. So I think that's definitely a major consideration there. I think that's really the thing that's missing overall is that picture of interaction. And that's why I had the intro that I did with the guitars kind of ringing out, because, you know, for me, part of playing the electric guitar is the whole symbiotic relationship between all the sum of its parts. And so that is, like I said, part of why I think that these modelers are still falling short, even though they've come miles from where they began. There's a huge element that's missing there because everything affects the sound and the tone that you get, from the strings you're using to the nut to the bridge to the pickups to the chord you're using, to how long that chord is, to how many pedals you're running through, to what amp you're using, to how you've EQ'd that amp, to how loud you're pushing that amp. Although the way that those sound waves then are in the room and then also cause vibrations on those strings. And that right there is exactly what those modelers are missing, because the whole point of those modelers is a silent stage, which takes out that whole part of having those sound waves in the room. So if you're missing those sound waves in the room that are coming back and hitting your guitar strings and causing additional vibrations, then you're missing a big piece of the sound puzzle there. And so your guitar is inevitably going to sound different in that situation. If you noticed, I used some different guitars in the course of that. I used a solid body Strat, and I used a 335 style semi-hollow body. So why did I do that? I did that because it actually follows the history and the technology curve of the electric guitar. See, in the early 30s, 40s, 50s, the guitars were all fully hollow or at best semi-hollow bodies, and that's why I use the 335, because it interacts differently than a solid body. One of the things they found is that because of the sound waves moving into the sound holes of the semi-hollows and reverberating around there, it created vibration in the wood, which caused the strings to vibrate and to feed back. And at that point, that was not something that they wanted. However, now, even in the example that I used, you can see how even just using a clean channel, it created a lot more sustain than you would have if the volume wasn't up loud enough in order to cause that slight feedback type of a situation to be happening. So as a result, that's why they went to the solid body. And so the solid body kind of caused less of that, but it still happens. And so that whole relationship between the sound waves and the volume in the room with the guitar is a huge piece that's missing. So in talking about the sound waves in the room, there's another elephant in the room there, and that gets into headroom. And when you start talking about headroom and volume and sound waves, there's also more interactions there, because even the same guitar amplifier at a different volume will sound different. Tubes will react differently than a modeling chip. It's just a simple fact that they will saturate at a different point. They will sag a little bit differently. And it's not necessarily a predictable thing. And that's kind of, I guess, the magic of it, is that tube amps just have their sound that you can't quite replicate, because as you turn up a digital modeler, you're just getting more volume of the same. You're not actually changing the way that interacts with all the components the way you do when you turn up an amplifier that's right in front of you. And also, if you've messed with headroom and volume, you'll know that when you play with pedals, that will drastically affect the sound that you get from those pedals. The more that you turn up the amp, the more headroom you give it, it's going to make your pedals sound different. It's going to interact differently because you're changing part of the equation that creates the sound. And so it's these interactions that I think is drastically missing, because you're taking out pieces of the puzzle and expecting the same result, and it's just scientifically not possible to do that. Like I said, that doesn't mean that there's not reasons why you wouldn't want, one of these silent stage options, and it doesn't mean they don't sound good. I'm not trying to argue that. I'm just trying to say that they don't interact the same, and for me, that affects the whole feel of the guitar. If your guitar isn't sustaining the same because it's not getting that vibrations going from those sound waves back on the guitar, then that's going to drastically affect the way that it feels. You know, the natural compression as you hit that threshold of breaking up on a tube amplifier is something that you can't quite quantify, and it doesn't happen with these digital modelers. It just isn't there. It doesn't do the same thing. It doesn't react the same. And so when you do that, you're totally affecting the feel and the tone of what you're playing. And also, I think that with that, there's also a psychological aspect to that as well. That if you don't feel like the guitar is playing the same, that you won't play the same. Your confidence level will be affected, or subconsciously you'll be approaching the parts differently because the guitar is not reacting maybe in the way that you're used to, or the same way that you would if you were playing through an actual tube rig at that time. So again, I'm not trying to dissuade anybody. I'm just trying to offer some thoughts to consider when looking at the whole picture here of what you're going for. And so maybe you can get your sound without these things, but it's just something to think about. So that's it for this week of Wolf Guitars and Gear. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Make sure you hit the bell to receive all future videos. Hit the like button and let us know what you think, whether you agree, disagree, have other thoughts on what I shared. And yes, I am aware, before somebody else mentions it, that you can use floor wedges to have monitors and to have some of that sound in the room type of a thing with one of these digital modelers. However, most people, when they're using it, is for a silent stage, and it does take that out of it. So that might be somewhat self-defeating if you were to use an actual floor wedge type of a monitor. But anyways, hope you had a great time, and we'll see you next week right back here on Wolf Guitars and Gear. Have a great week.